All right, welcome everyone. My name is Kaya Schilde. I'm the acting director of the Center for the Study of Europe at Boston University at the Pardee School of Global Studies. And I'm delighted today to announce our panel on reflections on contemporary faith-based responses to forced migration. The panel is global, it will be comparative, it is interdisciplinary, and reflecting that, it is co-sponsored by, in addition to the Center for the Study of Europe, the Center for Latin American Studies, the Initiative on Forced Migration and Human Trafficking, and the Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs at BU. The panelists today are Shai, Dromi, lecturer on sociology at Harvard University, Tanya Schwarz, executive director of Pi Sigma Alpha, David Sulewski, PhD candidate, Global Governance and Human Security at UMass Boston, Turek, Associate Professor of History and Director of Museum Studies at Trinity University in Texas, and Erin Wilson, Associate Professor of Global Politics and Religion at University of Groningen. I wanted to say just for 1 minute, I am here as a convener and not an expert on the topic, but I will be inviting the panelists to speak, and then I will also be looking at the Q&A function for taking attendee questions. The format we have for the next hour and a half is that we will be going, starting with David Sulewski, because he is a graduate student of mine, a PhD student, and I've been following his work closely for the last 4 years. I'm inspired by his emerging research agenda on humanitarian corridors and the role of religious actors in Italy specifically. He's been doing field work on the topic and is writing a dissertation on the topic. And so I've invited him to speak first, and then the other scholars to follow up. And we've invited everyone to speak largely on the topic, not just of humanitarian corridors, but on the role of religious actors and faith-based actors in this area of forced migration and humanitarian issues, which is an enduring, cross-cutting, always contemporary issue. All right, David.
Thank you so much. And it's really an honor to be here and to be with such an esteemed group of scholars. And I'm really looking forward to the broader discussion we'll have on this topic. So yeah, just to kick us off, I just will share a little bit about my dissertation project, which is ongoing. And I'm exploring how religious groups mobilize to overcome the resistance of dominant political power configurations of the state to expand pathways to protection for refugees. And I'm looking at humanitarian corridors in Europe as a case study and drawing my findings from field work I've done in both Italy and Belgium. So I'll share some observations, but I also want to flag some potential unintended consequences and challenges that may arise when religious actors engage with the state to try to admit refugees and other forced migrants. So what are humanitarian corridors and why are they important? So just to give a brief description, in 2015, a coalition of Christian organizations made up of the Catholic Lay Association Community of Sant'Egidio, Federation of Evangelical Churches, and the Waldensian Church, a pre-Reformation church, negotiated with the Italian government for approval to identify forced migrants in Lebanon based on criteria of vulnerability to receive a humanitarian visa, to travel to Italy, to apply for asylum, and to receive hospitality and integration support from the sponsoring religious groups. Motivated by their theologies of migration and their practices of solidarity with refugees and migrants, the religious groups conceptualized humanitarian corridors as a countervailing force to restrictive asylum and refugee admission policies, as well as the externalization of the EU borders, which make the central Mediterranean route the deadliest in the world. And similar Christian coalitions, as well as interfaith platforms, have replicated this model in France, Belgium, and even the small Principality of Andorra. So from a global refugee policy perspective, given recent political challenges to more systematic state-run resettlement programs, these smaller scale sponsorship programs initiated by non-state and often religious actors have recently attracted the attention of policymakers who are invested in expanding migration-based pathways to protection. And you could say that humanitarian corridors constitute a recent innovation in the field of resettlement, in part because the religious sponsors used an unconventional interpretation of existing visa regulations as the project's legal basis. They negotiated for the cooperation of national authorities. And they also tapped into their own networks of local NGOs and faith communities in transit countries like Lebanon, rather than delegate the selection and the movement of individuals to other agencies and international organizations like UNHCR and IOM. And from an analytical perspective, humanitarian corridors represent a compelling case study to explore how and why religious groups succeed in persuading states to expand pathways to protection when they really have no legal obligation to do so. And I also think that by bringing religion into the analysis, we can explore how religion offers both motivation and resources to religious groups to overcome the limits of state sovereignty, and as well as explore the ways that religion and migration politics can intersect, either to facilitate or inhibit collaboration between the state and non-state religious actors in creating these pathways. So let me just share 4 observations before moving on to challenges. One on motivation. The religious groups were motivated by their faith and ethical convictions to generate a solution that they themselves would carry out to mitigate migrant deaths and provide safe passage. And based on my interviews with UNHCR and government officials, the religious actors who started humanitarian corridors were certainly not considered traditional actors in resettlement. So this is a rather new addition to their portfolio of activities. However, each religious group had engaged in outreach services and advocacy in support of migrants and refugees, and each really received the tragic news of migrant deaths as a question demanding a concrete response. One religious representative said that they wanted to, quote, fill a normative gap in EU asylum policy, which was failing miserably. And another said that in the face of, quote, the most unreliable political systems in the world, where politics today are dry, lacking in vision, the churches must do something else, which is to render a service of creativity, to stand on the front of ethics. Now, for the religious groups to create a sponsorship program, their motivation must be matched with certain capabilities and resources to do so. And in the case of humanitarian corridors, the religious groups formed a coalition to pool expertise and resources, and they leveraged what Christian Smith called privileged legitimacy, which is when the religious groups have access to political figures and structures. And they were able to engage directly with the relevant politicians and bureaucrats to negotiate the agreements that made this project possible. And also, in addition to the ways that religious groups made strategic use of their privileged legitimacy, the actors also benefited from the structuring of church-state relations. In Italy, for example, the Waldensians utilized the 8 per mille tax scheme, where taxpayers pay a compulsory 1/1000th of their annual tax income to either an organized religion or a state-sponsored social program. And so I think here that the evolution of church-state relations and the evolving position of historically marginalized and persecuted churches like the Waldensians in accessing material support from the state provided a uniquely fertile ground for religious groups to mobilize financial resources through a kind of state-enforced tithe to sustain humanitarian corridors in Italy. And I think this observation also shows that often we talk about these sponsorship programs as private, but I'm kind of showing how that sort of public-private line gets a bit blurred in these kinds of projects. And then in the case of Belgium, the Napoleonic Concordat that mediates church-state relations since 1801 is actually still in force. And it mandates the regular meeting of head of state with heads of officially recognized religions. And while this Concordat reinforces the state's control over the functionalities of religion, religious groups inform me that it created an opportunity structure for them to access decision makers and in the end be able to convince a member of a right-wing nationalist political party who's known for very strong anti-immigrant attitudes to actually give the green light to this project. And then a final observation is in both Italy and Belgium, the religious groups tapped into their extensive domestic networks, parishes, volunteer associations, and NGOs across the country as a way of trying to provide an individualized and diffuse form of hospitality, but while also satisfying their own interests and that of the state to not use the state-run asylum reception systems. And this is true in both countries. So for this faith-based initiative, religion as a source of motivation and material support mattered significantly. However, my findings seem to suggest that when it came to persuading the state, negotiation to find alignment with political and national interests that were often competing, and framing the mobilization of resources in terms of guaranteeing project feasibility with minimal cost to the state seemed to have been much more effective than any sort of religious or moral argument. So now, while humanitarian corridors certainly represent a contemporary example of how religious groups respond to the urgent needs of others in innovative ways, it is important to note some of the unintended consequences of their interventions and flag some of the challenges. So one challenge I've observed is that a power imbalance characterizes public, private, or state, non-state religious engagement. As one religious leader told me, the Italian government, quote, had every reason to say no to the proposal. And sponsorship schemes, according to Audrey Macklin in a recent article, embody a form of collaborative politics, but they actually entail much more resistance than might be supposed. And my analysis shows that there was certainly resistance coming from both the state and religious actors at different points and over different issues, and that the religious actors' negotiation skills in part mattered significantly for how they were able to overcome this power imbalance. So for example, in Belgium, a tension arose between the religious groups in the state over the very practical matter of agreeing upon who will be selected and on what basis. The religious groups espoused the liberal norm of admitting individuals based on individualized criteria of vulnerability, and the state held the position of exercising discretion of who enters or who doesn't in terms of religious and national identity. And so the ability of the religious actors to resist compromising on the selection criteria speaks to the important role that religious non-state groups can play in actually shaping states' preferences regarding its exercise of sovereignty and not letting sovereignty go uncontested in the ways that the state exercises it. And in terms of unintended consequences, I am exploring in the research how actors who seek collaboration with the state as a way of overcoming the practical operations of sovereignty that limit refugee admissions end up participating and perhaps even reinforcing some of those same practices. Participating with the state in identifying vulnerable migrants to receive a visa certainly creates an opening in the so-called fortress Europe, while also strengthening the EU's external border management. In other words, and this has come up in the way that state actors talk about this project, enhancing pathways such as humanitarian corridors can be used as both a rhetorical and policy tool to further discourage irregular migration and justify restrictive asylum measures. And finally, humanitarian corridors by design operate on an ad hoc basis, at least for now. On one hand, this certainly allows for the religious groups to have considerable flexibility and autonomy in how they design and operate pathways to protection. On the other hand, it also raises questions around sustainability and scalability. And furthermore, because religious actors need to return periodically to the state to renegotiate the renewal of their agreements, it raises some questions about the transparency around how these kinds of initiatives are designed, and if it just means that there are some religious groups as opposed to others that can actually pull something like this off. But to conclude, despite these challenges, the religious actors' success in persuading initially reluctant, even resistant states to partner, and the continual renewal or success in the continual renewal of this project speaks to their skills in part in negotiation to exert influence over the state in the sovereignty-sensitive area of refugee and asylum policy. So thank you very much. Looking forward to hearing from others and to a great discussion.
Thank you so much, David. The next person, I'm going in the order now. I put David first, but I'm going in the order of the posters. So next we have Shai Dromi.
Hi, everybody. Hello. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this talk, and thank you, of course, to David for sharing his this really exciting project with us. What I thought I would do is I would talk just a little bit about where I'm coming from into this topic and where my work kind of speaks to this, and then spend a few minutes responding to David's really exciting project and the very helpful prompts that he provided us panelists. So just in a nutshell, I'm a comparative historical sociologist with an interest in the intersection of religion and humanitarian aid. And my work joins sociologists who see religion as a site for societies to evaluate themselves ethically. And this includes Jose Casanova, Robert Wuthnow, and others who have written in this tradition, with the idea being that religion isn't just a private affair or an organizational affair, but it's also a site where communities come together and evaluate political, economic, social processes underway within their societies, and occasionally form criticisms of what they see as unacceptable. And in the context of humanitarianism, this would often mean situations like humanitarian crises, like immigrant crises, immigrant relief, and so on. So, and this joins again, like a long history of sociological thinking in this direction. For example, from Peter Stamatov, who showed how historically the actors who have raised the alarm in the face of slavery, in the face of warfare, have been religious actors, who were in a way moved to criticize because they were seeing these phenomena as unacceptable on no account, right? And as requiring indirect action. Now, I myself have worked on the NGO sector, on the humanitarian NGO sector, and showing in a similar manner that because a group of 19th century Swiss Calvinists were scandalized by the meager aid provisions that were available for people wounded in warfare on the battlefield, that sense of scandal, of unacceptability, is what motivated the project that we know today as the Red Cross movement, right? That these aid organizations originated with religious actors saying, we cannot let this continue. This is something that defies any norm under God's law. So, when we often think about religion and humanitarianism, this is where I think David's project really shines. We often think about the link between religion and humanitarianism as something that belongs to the private sphere. A person was motivated because of their religious upbringing, and they grew up and they went and joined Doctors Without Borders, right, as a fulfillment of their private religious convictions. And I think it is extremely important, especially in this day and age, to return attention to the public role that religion and religious actors play in pushing forward projects like humanitarian corridors, and especially in the context of secularization, increasing non-sectarian humanitarian actor presence. It is doubly important to kind of ponder on this. So with that, let me turn to David's project. I think David asked, is it a generalizable project? And I think absolutely generalizable, in the sense that it's certainly not the only religious advocacy movement or organization around today. I can mention World Vision International doing unbelievable work, have been doing a phenomenal work in addressing COVID internationally, and in working, not always in direct cooperation, but at least in tandem with state efforts to alleviate needs like PPE, like contact tracing, and so on. So this project is important because this is a phenomenon that's global, and in many ways increasingly common under COVID. And there are, of course, many historical examples. Some of them are in my own work. One classic example is the American Red Cross's intervention in Armenia in the 1890s. So this is a time where the first major massacres that kind of preceded the 1914 massacres really started emerging, and the American Red Cross was able not only to mobilize internationally, but also actually reach the Sultan's court in Constantinople to advocate to provide some level of aid for the Armenians, and much of the discourse around them was that they were fellow Christians, right, and that there is some affinity between the Red Cross, which still perceived, was still staffed primarily by religiously devout Christians, and that other population that they were seeing across the globe. And there's a wonderful book by Heather Curtis called Holy Humanitarians that touched, it's on a different topic, but it touches on this episode very well, and I think really captures it well. I think one thing that struck me, you were asking about what insights from an academic perspective would I have into what makes this such example successful. And I think, like, hearing you talk about this and also reading your summary, I saw that your focus is primarily on strategies, resource mobilizations, resources. And while those are important, I think the one thing that religious organizations have that many non-sectarian organizations don't have, right, is that's privileged public standing that you mentioned. And I think I would actually push you to focus on that as your key variable, because resource mobilization, political opportunities, and so on are common to all organizations, non-sectarian and sectarian alike, right? Whereas here we have something that's actually unique to the organizations that you're interested in. And I think that also is a question today, again, in a secularizing European context. I think that really would bring out perhaps the unique capacities of humanitarian corridors to intervene. I will only, running out of time, so I want to say just one additional thing that in a way makes your paper so much more interesting. The humanitarian community tends to differentiate between faith-based and non-sectarian aid. And Monica Krause mentioned this briefly in her book, but there is some antagonism and suspicion between secular organization and religious organizations, to the level that they're actually, they have problems cooperating and so on. I actually interviewed an activist, a Muslim woman who volunteered in Albania for working with Syrian refugees there. Got there, with a sense of affinity to the refugees, was expecting to see other Muslims there, and was dismayed by the fact that not only was she the only hijab wearing woman on the aid giver side, but that she was also looked upon with a great deal of suspicion, not only by the other aid workers who were asking why is she here, but actually also from the beneficiaries, right, who were saying, like, wait a minute, is she one of us, or what is her role here? So I think exploring kind of the relationship between between humanitarian corridors and secular organizations would really highlight something that we still don't know a lot about, which is how those tensions work out and play out in contemporary disasters that are being addressed. So I'm out of time, so I'll stop here, but I would love to continue the conversation in the Q&A.
Thank you so much. And our next speaker is Tanya Schwarz.
Great, thank you. Thank you for having me. This is a great panel. It's great to see some friendly faces. I'll do sort of a little bit of the same thing, which is a very brief summary of my own work and how it relates to David's project. And then what David's project sort of brought up for me, the sort of questions and perhaps insights. So my own work very similarly looks at faith-based organizations working in peace building, broadly defined. So that includes humanitarian work, but also things like conflict resolution, human rights advocacy, et cetera. And what I've most been interested in is sort of what is the religion doing in these spaces, right? So much of what we do in this academic space is we often throw around these terms of faith-based and religious and whatever. And my question was always like, what does that mean? What do we mean when we say these groups are faith-based? What does it mean when we say that they're doing religious work? And the sort of approach that I took to that was really trying to understand, one, what these groups, how they understood themselves. So how they understood their own so-called religious identities, their practices, their belief system, things like that, their values. And then two, I wanted to know sort of how that interacted with their engagement on the ground with local communities. So one, in terms of the, benefits or limits of how efficient or effective they could be in doing what they were trying to do. But then two, I was also very concerned with the ethics of their behaviors. So what kind of ethical concerns might we have about these kinds of organizations doing the work that they do? What kinds of effects are they having, in this instance, on the migrants that they're assisting, for instance? So that's sort of my sort of framework, my approach to this kind of work. And so I really enjoyed reading this paper and reading the summary of the dissertation. I think it is fascinating, and I look forward to reading the full work when it is complete. And so just a few things that came up to me when I was reading this and thinking through some of my own work and others' work of the scholars here on the panel, was one, we want to think about two things. One, sort of, as I said, what's the sort of effects or limits? How effective, how efficient are these kind of organizations, and how might they differ from so-called secular organizations, like Shai pointed out? And so I think very clearly what comes out in David's work is the role of funding and the role of networks and access, right? And so thinking through how these organizations, one, I mean, it seems to be that one of the key reasons they were able to do this at all was that they have the funds and they're able to completely do it all by themselves, right? So that's a key feature here of their success. But also, I really loved the discussion about the networks, not just the access to the state, which I think is absolutely important. And I agree with Shai, is something that I think could be delved into a bit more, or perhaps already is in the dissertation. But also the networks with the local groups on the ground. So the people who are actually engaged with the local communities that they are trying to help, right? And some of my own work focuses specifically on the role of prayer for these organizations and what prayer is doing within the context of peace building work and humanitarian work. And I loved that there was this mention of the fact that many of the networks that were created came out directly of this, these large prayer meetings that they had, which I absolutely had seen in my own work, that this is a real, this is a place of really building strong relationships among many of these communities. And so I think that it's a place that could be explored more, not necessarily for this project, but I would love to see, someone sort of delve into that a little bit more, the sort of effects of building networks within a prayer space. But another kind of benefit that I didn't see here that I just wanted to kind of highlight that I found in my own work of these kind of organizations, and I'd be interested to hear if there was any of this happening in the humanitarian corridors, is psychosocial care, what many people are calling psychosocial care. So the idea is that one of the ways that faith-based organizations differ, or an additional service that they can provide to the communities that they are helping in a humanitarian context, is psychosocial care. They can provide them with some sort of access to services that would support them in their religious or spiritual well-being. And that can take on a lot of forms. That can be something like, providing a Bible, or inviting them to a prayer service, or providing them with access to an imam, or a pastor, or whatever. So I'd be interested to hear if there was any of that going on here. And then some of the limits that I didn't see in this work, but that I've seen sort of in my own work, is that while these organizations do have very strong networks, they're often limited, right? They are limited based on who they are, based on their sort of own value system, based on where they've been working. So it seemed like some of the organizations you were looking at, David, definitely they had strong relationships with other organizations in Lebanon, but not necessarily Turkey, for instance, right? And so that definitely creates some limits there to what they can do and what they're sort of experts in. And then another thing that you pointed out that I would agree with as well is this question of longevity. Can these kinds of programs not only be scaled up, but can they actually stay for the duration? Can they be institutionalized more? And so they're not this thing that kind of comes for 5 or 10 years and then goes after the crisis is so-called over. And then turning to, I have a few minutes, turning to the ethics. Now, this is really the question that I'm most interested in for my own work. What are the ethics involved in these particular kind of groups becoming involved in humanitarian work and working with particularly vulnerable communities like the ones that you are studying, David? And in particular, my question is, what kind of power do these kinds of groups have? As I mentioned, they are fully funded by the groups. They don't have support necessarily from the state, although there's not a fine line there. But also these groups seem to be running most of everything. They're helping to select the migrants. They're helping to get them to where they need to be. They are then on the other end, helping them to acclimate and to find places to live and things like that. In my mind, that is a lot of power for specific groups to have. And so my questions would be, what exactly is going into all of that? And in what ways are they engaging with the migrants in ways that could be beneficial, potentially through things like psychosocial care, or detrimental? So of course, there are a lot of people who bring up the problem of proselytization, right? So I think that's something that has to be taken seriously. It is something that happens. And if we want to protect the cultural autonomy, the religious autonomy of the people that these organizations are trying to help, then I think you have to take it seriously. And that also, I'll just say, that happens not just across the sort of main religions, Christian to Muslim, et cetera. It's also within Christianity, right? Many different kinds of Christianity exist. And so, Christians try to proselytize to other Christians to get them to come over to their side, right? But also in some of my work with Cecilia Lynch, we also talked about not just religious proselytism, but what we call kind of donor proselytism. So the idea that there are certain kinds of ways of thinking about the best way to live in a society, the best way to think about the marketplace or the economy or what have you. And these are things that seem or are portrayed as very neutral within the development community, but as we argue, are definitely not. And so I'd be interested to know, what kinds of discourses are these kinds of organizations engaging with when they are in contact with these vulnerable populations, and what kind of effects are they having there? And then I'm just about out of time, but one final thing I'll leave with you here is I would like to know more about how these groups think about values like justice, or think about values like peace, or even think about humanitarianism. Because in my own work, what I sort of argue is that determines, or that greatly influences how they approach something like conflict resolution or humanitarian work. It definitely changes the way that they approach these things, the kinds of services they provide, how they provide those services. So I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about, do they have different ideas across the organizations about why they're doing what they're doing and what that means. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And our next panelist is Lauren Turek.
Thank you so much for the invitation to get to read and engage with this really exciting scholarship. David, your work sheds a lot of important light on how these faith-based non-state actors can and have shaped global policies through their moral authority, their ecumenical networks, their funding sources, and their negotiation tactics. So I'm a historian of US foreign relations, and a lot of my work looks at domestic and non-state actors and their influence on US foreign policy in the 20th century. So I've written a lot about how politically conservative evangelical groups in the US became a foreign policy lobbying force, and they were really interested in particular on issues related to religious freedom. So they're very concerned about religious persecution. And so one of the things I write about is how starting in the 1970s, evangelicals are engaged in a project of creating religious networks with their co-religionists. And as they're learning about what's happening abroad, as they're learning about political threats to evangelism, they are able to mobilize to lobby Congress to do things like impose sanctions on countries that are persecuting Christians, or if they identify pro-evangelical or anti-communist leaders in other parts of the world, they were pushing the US to implement beneficial policies for those regimes. So we're seeing that in places like Guatemala, South Africa, and elsewhere. And they used a lot of human rights language to frame that advocacy when they were testifying in Congress. And in many cases, Christian refugees who were coming to the US from Soviet bloc countries were key actors there. So I was very intrigued by how you were framing notions of networking and moral authority, because those are also key themes that come up in my work. So I found your argument really fascinating. It also prompted a lot of thoughts for me about how the initiative that you're studying compares to the US context, particularly today, because US Christian and Jewish groups are instrumental in the refugee resettlement process here in the United States. So I thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about how the US system evolved by way of comparison, and use that to kind of weigh in on some of the questions that you posed to us, though not all of them, because some of them are kind of future focused, and historians are not great prognosticators. So I will focus on the kind of the historical context here. So faith-based organizations have for a very long time played a role as a partner to the US government in refugee resettlement. This goes back decades to the Displaced Persons Act, which was a piece of legislation that was put in place in 1948 and was in existence until 1952. It was legislation that was aimed at helping resettle European refugees, though it is important to note it initially blocked Jewish refugees. And throughout the Cold War, the US was accepting and resettling refugees fleeing from numerous communist countries. But a lot of that legislation and resettlement activity was really ad hoc. There would be a kind of flurry of activity as a refugee crisis emerged, and when there were moments of more mass or forced migration. So there wasn't a systematic approach to refugee resettlement on the part of the US government. And this changes in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. Because at that point, the United States was grappling with this enormous number of refugees coming from Southeast Asia. Hundreds of thousands of people were fleeing violence in Vietnam and Cambodia. And the ad hoc system was not very effective. Presidential action was allowing for about 300,000 or so refugees to come to the United States between 1975 and 1979. But these are enormous numbers. And the challenge that posed really pushed Congress to act to create a more systematic approach to resettling refugees. And so in 1979, the Senate passed a Refugee Act, which Carter signed into law in early 1980, and it becomes this Refugee Act of 1980, which is it establishes the structure we have today. And it created this permanent system for the US government to set a ceiling for refugee admissions, to define who counted as a refugee, right? So, I mean, that might be an interesting area for us to talk about in terms of the groups that you're studying. How do they define refugees? The US uses the UN standard that it should be a person with a, quote, well-founded fear of persecution. This legislation also created an office for refugee resettlement and established procedures for vetting refugees. And that is, I think, really crucial for our discussion here and for thinking about your work, because your groups that you studied were a key part of that vetting process, which is very interesting. in the United States, it is this office, this federal office and its leadership, they are working with private faith-based organizations to help the country resettle refugees. So they're doing some of that work, but they are not involved in the vetting process in the way that the groups you are talking about. So right now in the US, there are about 9 major organizations that partner with the State Department to support refugee resettlement. 6 of those 9 are faith-based. It's World Relief, Church World Service, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, Episcopal Migration Ministries, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, and the US Conference of Catholic Bishops. So mostly Christian groups, only some of which are really ecumenical in any like serious way. What's interesting, David, you talk about in the paper how humanitarian corridors provides, quote, a concrete model that other European nations can replicate, where you're also seeing sponsoring religious groups push back against political inaction. And so it was interesting to think about that in the US context, because in the US, those faith-based organizations that are working on refugee resettlement, they have been engaged in pushing back against the efforts of the Trump administration, for example, to drastically lower the cap on refugee resettlement. I mean, Trump in 2020 lowered it to 15,000, a historically low number. When the Biden administration was very slow to act to raise that cap, these faith-based groups were very active in pushing for him to get a move on and raise it higher. And they've been instrumental in continuing to put that pressure on, even though we haven't seen the full number of potential refugees admitted. But that said, like the model of what US groups do is really different. Again, in Europe, it sounds like these groups are aiding in identifying who might be a refugee and who could be vetted. In the United States, that is the job of the State Department and federal agencies. They run that process. They have a system where potential refugees, admittees would register with the UN Commissioner for Refugees. They screen and then refer applicants to the State Department. The State Department has a bunch of resettlement support centers. There's a number of federal agencies that do screening, particularly security of background checks. The Department of Homeland Security is involved, Health and Human Services. There's a lot of federal work that goes into screening and admitting the refugees. And it's only after that, after refugees are screened and approved in the US, that the faith-based groups come in, and they're helping with resettlement. They're funneling federal money to help refugees pay for rent and that sort of thing. And they also, I think, interestingly and importantly, help figure out where in the country those refugees should be resettled. So this is very different from the humanitarian corridors model. It does raise sort of questions. I'm not sure that the US faith-based groups would be in a position to have the same kind of vetting authority. It seems very different there. So it's interesting to me, this comparison with Europe, and sort of raising the question of why are these political differences that sort of explain that, what the context is. I was also really interested in your work to see the way in which the history of persecution inspired the commitment of your religious groups to engage with this. This is a connection that I also saw with my work. There's a lot of motivation coming from the groups that I study because they're concerned about persecution of their co-religionists. So it's really informing it. They're motivated to support persecuted brethren abroad. But that also raises some of the risks. So one of the questions you asked us is, what are the potential risks as opposed to the benefits of this? A lot of the groups that I studied, and some of the groups that engage in refugee resettlement in the United States, have a really strong faith-based commitment to evangelize. And they take that very seriously. And on the ground, it can get blurred in terms of, especially in the US, where they're very clearly working in very tight coordination with the government. Is this a US government sponsored evangelism, right? That can be less clear on the ground. Officially, no, they're separate, but that can be dicey. But we also see that the fact that these groups are there and engaging in missionary work and humanitarian work, it does make these Christian groups, it puts them in a position to speak really authoritatively on foreign policy issues. It creates this network where they can leverage their connections abroad to push for particular policy interventions. But again, there's that risk, that question of like, what is the motive? Why are they there? Does that dilute in some way the work that they're doing, which I think is just a sort of open, ethical, philosophical question. Anyway, so I'm just about out of time. I was really excited to read this. I think there will be a lot that we can all discuss. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And our last panelist is Erin Wilson.
Thanks very much, Kaya. What an honor to be part of this panel and with such great thinkers and read this amazing work that David has done and be able to comment on it. I was really grateful to be asked because Monday last week, I gave a lecture on the topic of climate refugees for the students in my class on climate change, end times, and sustainable futures. And as the name of the course implies, it's not exactly a cheerful class. The students often leave quite depressed. And the lecture last week was no different because, I was sharing with them some of the statistics about the current situation and then also estimations for what is coming in the future. And a lot of them were they're unaware of the current global numbers and the minuscule rate of resettlement that we're seeing, and the predictions that these numbers are only going to go up. So the predictions about how many people are going to be displaced by 2050 is we're looking at anywhere between 700 million and 1.2 billion in various different reports that have come out. And what we know, like there is currently less than 5% of the total globally displaced population that were resettled last year and all were able to return home. And when we, like those kinds of figures demonstrate that our current global structures of governing migration are grossly inadequate for dealing with the scale and speed of contemporary displacement, let alone what we're likely to see in the future as a result of climate change, on top of other factors that force people to move. And part of this lecture, because the course is it's actually called The End of the World as We Know It ? But yes, we're looking at sort of the role of religion and end times narratives in climate change and imaginings about that. So I was sharing with them how religion is entangled in global migration in various different ways as a marker of identity, used as the basis for belonging and exclusion, as you talked about, David, and a driver of displacement through persecution, part of the discourses that surround migration and justifications for providing or denying protection to particular groups. But also, as we've also heard from the other panelists, that like service providers for people experiencing displacement. And so the role of religion and religious actors in this sector is incredibly complicated and diverse. And so it was in this context, as part of this lecture, that I shared the Humanitarian Corridors project with my students. And we've talked about, and Shai has also talked about one of the things that the Humanitarian Corridors project does is highlight the uniqueness in terms of the roles of religious actors in global migration. And I think also from what Lauren was saying, Humanitarian Corridors itself is actually quite unique amongst what religious actors already do. And that makes it particularly interesting. But the other reason why I shared this with my students is because I think Humanitarian Corridors is an example of the alternatives that are possible if we think creatively and outside the boundaries of current structures and the current stereotypes and biases and assumptions in global politics that structure a lot of the way that we think about this, in particular, how we think about religion and religious actors, how we think about the state, and how we think about people experiencing displacement. But also, one of the things that the Humanitarian Corridors project got me thinking about was the fact that, to me at least, it signals potential shifts that might be occurring in the governance of global migration that are maybe echoed in the governance of other global issues in terms of the roles of state and non-state actors that we as scholars interested in these dynamics should, I think, be paying attention to into the future. And so I'm just going to pull some of these stereotypes and assumptions out, and then also some of these shifts in global governance. And Kaya, I wanted to say as well, if I talk too long, just cut me off, like just jump in and shut me up. So first, thinking about how this project challenges the ways in which or the stereotypes and assumptions that we make about religion and religious actors. And we've seen some of this in comments from the other panelists as well. Like there's always concerns within the development and humanitarian sector and with regard to religious actors' involvement in migration about their potential taking advantage of their position of power when it comes to their engagement with vulnerable people. And so, proselytizing, as Tanya was talking about as well. Other assumptions that kind of prevail in this sector is that religious actors are marginal, or we also was also pointed out that religious actors are considered to be sort of private, but also, as David commented, this public-private divide gets very blurred in a lot of these partnerships. That religion is, if anything, a source of violence, and it's a source of persecution within forced migration. Or the flip side of that, they're providers of support and comfort. So this is very sort of, the good religion, bad religion narrative that we see coming out in other sectors in global politics as well. But what the Humanitarian Corridors Project tells a different story. So it shows us that religious actors, they can take on these sorts of roles of responsibility and governance. They can negotiate in sort of very, for want of a better term, a-religious ways, as David was talking about, in terms of the practicalities, like how is this program actually going to work? How do we get the state to actually be involved? They're not interested in religious arguments or ethical arguments or anything. They just want to know if it's going to work and how is it going to be of least cost to them, both politically and financially. And the Humanitarian Corridors Project shows that religious actors are quite capable of sort of shifting this identity and this discourse. But what it also shows is that this category of religion operates in multiple ways in the context of migration. And so maybe it's a little bit of a bugbear of mine, so my apologies, but I think we need to be much more precise about the language that we use when we're talking about quote unquote religion in global politics more generally, but also in migration. And rather than sort of just use this general category of religion, talk about, are we talking about religion as identity? Are we talking about religion as religious actors, or as religious narratives that structure the way we think? And David, you spoke to this as like religion as a source of motivation, and religion and their resources are important, but yeah, and there I would say, you also need to make a distinction between religious beliefs or theology and also religious institutions and the resources that they have. So that's something that I think we can all do better at, maybe, is a way to put that. In terms of assumptions about states, I'm very guilty of this. I'm quite cynical and somewhat despairing when it comes to states and changes to global migration. It's very easy to assume that states are driven by exclusionary politics, that they're unwilling to allow more people in, that right-wing populism and anti-immigrant sentiment are prevailing and providing the main parameters of immigration policy. And I also don't want to downplay the seriousness of these trends, nor the disastrous impact that dominant discourses linking Islam and extremism that have had on the politics of migration. And this trend has cemented migration, perhaps irrevocably, as a threat to security rather than a solution to humanitarian catastrophes in the minds of many voters, and therefore also within the policy portfolios of governments. But again, as the Humanitarian Corridors example shows, states may have some openness to alternative possibilities that can create more safe legal pathways to protection. And again, David pointed this out in his remarks, that this initiative's been rhetorically mobilized to justify harsh border policies and policing of irregular migration. And that's probably not something that can be avoided, unfortunately. I think spin is just a part of the political condition, at least in terms of contemporary settings. People experiencing displacement and the assumptions that we make about those, about people and in those situations and what they need, What I found really interesting about the humanitarian corridors case is this: they attempt to expand the criteria by which people receive protection by including this criterion of vulnerability, and which isn't a criteria of the UN Convention definition. And I'm really curious exactly how vulnerability is defined and measured. So I'd love to hear more about that. But nonetheless, I think this is a really interesting development, and it responds in some ways to the threats or the things that people need protection from, that Alexander Betts has talked about in terms of what he calls survival migration. The reasons people need protection are not only related to persecution or abuse of rights, but also the deprivation of rights and indirect threats to survival. And so I think this inclusion of the criterion of vulnerability, it's not without its problems. It can reinforce power imbalances, because there's this idea that, especially in the minds of many publics in European or North American context, there is this idea that deserving, quote unquote, deserving refugees are necessarily vulnerable. So, and to what extent does this criterion of vulnerability play into the portrayal of refugees as victims as such? But at the same time, I still think this is a really interesting development that perhaps challenges these sort of broad parameters and offers a way to respond to things like climate migration, as an example. I'm going to move on now to the shifts in global governance. I think, the fact that non-state actors are involved in the actual determination of policy and decision-making regarding protection, this is a really interesting trend in terms of the broader kind of state-centric structure of international politics. And we see similar kinds of trends happening with regards to climate change and emissions reductions, where city-level governance and non-state actors at that level are often taking the lead in the development of policy around emissions reductions, for example, before national governments do. The cooperation between the Italian government and the Christian partner organizations suggests that, well, I'm wondering whether this is possible, whether they might be able to hold the various actors accountable and keep each other's worst excesses in check, like the fact that they're working together. Maybe there's possibilities there for them to both kind of even out each other's worst aspects. I don't know, but maybe that's something, David, that you can share with us. This has been talked about a bit as well. The program is reflective of established power structures and the privileged position of Christianity and Christian actors in the European context, and particularly, well, just generally within the European context. And as Shai pointed out, this is one of the unique aspects of the Humanitarian Corridors project that made it possible. But I'm also wondering if there's a danger that this program reinforces the power relationships and imbalances for people from non-Christian backgrounds and contexts, and kind of reinforces this idea that Christianity is part of European cultural heritage rather than being religion, and therefore it's still permitted to have a role. Religious actors are still allowed to have a role within the public sphere in the European context. And at the same time, on the one hand, is it reinforcing certain power structures? At the same time, it's by prioritizing the most vulnerable, it also offers an important counterbalance to other kinds of power structures and power imbalances being cemented in a growing number of neoliberal state-led initiatives, such as the citizenship or permanent residency by investment. So I think this attention for the most vulnerable, for the marginalized, for those who are excluded from the dominant sort of power structures and power frameworks, I think is also a really important contribution or dynamic within this field. And so regardless of all of these questions, what the project has done is meant that there are now more options for obtaining protection for vulnerable people, for people who may not meet the strict criteria for refugee protection under this program than there were before it existed. And it's small, is it scalable? It's got its problems, but it's the safe legal pathways for obtaining protection that we urgently need in global migration politics, and especially into the future. And that's why I shared this project with my students when they were so overwhelmed by the dire realities of contemporary migration and the prospects for the future. Because however small the numbers that have been helped by the program, especially in comparison with the global situation, it shows that there are alternatives that are possible, especially if we think creatively. So thank you again so very much. I really enjoyed this, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This panel's already far exceeded my already high expectations. So I'm going to invite us to have a discussion amongst the panelists. There's so much richness and opportunity here, but I wanted to, before the conversation starts to evolve even further, ask my colleague, Jeremy Menchik, who introduced me to many of the scholars on the panel. He had a question, a prompt that he wanted to see the panelists react to as they answer and as they discuss further. So Jeremy.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Kaya. This is a tremendous panel. Thank you, Lauren and Tanya and Shai and Erin, for teaching David and learning from David. It's unusual to have this kind of high level panel on such a specific topic, interdisciplinary. I feel incredibly lucky because I read your work on a regular basis. Lauren, I literally was reading your piece on Christian nationalism, your 2016 piece yesterday. Erin's book, I think 2012 book on secularism. Tanya's book is a staple, and her ISQ article is like kind of an inspiration for my next project. And most of my books are in boxes right now because I'm moving offices, but not Shai's. So it's really quite. It's a privilege to get to learn from your beautiful faces when mostly I just get to read your beautiful words on the page. So with that in mind, big question, right? You are agenda setting scholars, right? In your specific disciplines and also within the broader interdisciplinary field of religion and international affairs, whether that's foreign policy, NGOs, morality and social theory, European refugee issues. What should the future agenda of scholars be, right? David is going to be stepping into your shoes, following in your path. So what do you think future scholars who are working on religion and international affairs should be tackling, right? As agenda setters, tell us where we should be going next. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeremy. And I kind of thought rather than forcing everyone to do a round robin, perhaps we can just unmute ourselves, speak, raise your hand while the person's speaking to signal that you're next. And if anything gets confusing, I'll step in. But I want to let it be a little bit organic.
Jeremy, great question. Very broad question. What should the future agenda be? I'm just going to say this is from my own sort of personal perspective that I think aligns pretty closely with Erin's, according to how she was talking about her course. I'm feeling a bit of pressure to focus on what's coming, this sort of slow and quicker moving catastrophe that we're seeing unfold across various spectrums, across political spaces, environmental spaces, social spaces, etc. So for me, while intellectually, I still am really interested in the question of, what religion is, what we call religion, what we call faith-based, etc. I think now I'm kind of much more interested in what are we doing to deal with the issues that are being put in front of us. And so I really liked Erin's way of talking about or thinking about humanitarian corridors as a creative way to deal with this problem. And I didn't necessarily see it that way, but now that's making me sort of rethink it. And I like this idea of thinking about, yeah, we still need to think about what are the potential limits, what are the potential ethical problems, yes, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We should be thinking through like what works here, what are the things that are really helping us here, what are the tools that these organizations are using that we can think about and use and build on. So for me, I think that I would say the future agenda should really be what are specific things that different kinds of actors all over the globe can be doing to deal with these multi-layered crises that we are dealing with today.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all. Jeremy, it's nice to, similarly nice to put a face to the work. And I just wanted to kind of highlight to David that I think the four of us agreed that there is something unique about about religion that needs to be brought out more forcefully in your work. And I think the four of us in different ways, we're asking about how does this organization differ from a secular organization that might be trying to do the same thing? So, and that comment actually connects to my answer to David's to Jeremy's comment, which is I think like I'm with more and more work emerging on development and on humanitarianism. I think we're losing sight of what might be the unique features of religion today in the modern world. And there could be an explanation to this that, you know, historically, at least sociology has been, you know, very, very committed to the secularization thesis. And even though it's been 20 years, more than 20 years of rejections and objections to the secularization thesis, I think outside of the sociology of religion, common sense appears to be that, oh yeah, some actors are religious, but overall, the kind of religion is going away. It's declining in importance. Even though the facts, the figures are not, do not support that, right? I mean, the world is more religious than it used to be. Global religion is growing. Islam is growing. Christianity globally is growing. Both the United States and Europe are less irreligious than scholars several decades ago would have predicted, right? So I think that there's one thing that I would really urge you know, both David and additional scholars to do is not to just look at the resources and the mobilization strategies that religious organizations use, you know, as additional examples of the resources social movements use, but actually to focus to ask really, so what does faith do? I believe Tanya mentioned, you know, there might be certain forms of aid that come with certain forms of faith, you know, handing a Bible to someone. Some of us might scoff, but others might see that as a very, very significant way of offering holistic aid that not only looks at the body, but looks at the soul. And I would urge you and others who are working on this today to really go back to the question of like faith and like the core of religious organizations that then activates all the resources that they have and all the networks that they have, and pushes them to go to go and actually do something about it. So yeah, that would be my approach to it, but I'm looking forward to seeing what others say as well.
I very much agree with what Shai just said. And I was also really appreciative for what Erin said about the need to think really carefully about how we're defining religion and what we're talking about. Are we talking about the ways that beliefs motivate action, and what is the mechanism for that? Are we talking about practices? Are we talking about organizations? And so to me, especially, again, thinking in the context of, like, again, inspired by Erin, a world where we're going to see even more refugees with climate change. And in the context, I think for me, again, as like a US historian, thinking about the sense of besiegement and which is disproportionate, but the sense of besiegement that many conservative Christians feel because of the changing political context, not just of the United States, but the world. The ways in which that sense and kind of identification that, like, oh, you know, we're being persecuted. I mean, they're not, but there's that sense of identification with persecuted Christians elsewhere in the world, the way that that can actually motivate particular types of political activism and particular reactionary politics and reactionary organizing. But one of the things that I'm sort of excited to see future scholarship look at and do more work on are the mechanisms by which actors, both historically and in the present, are are pushing for change? How are they shaping government policies? What is the actual, how do you actually translate a sort of what seems like it could potentially be a somewhat inchoate belief in something to a specific lobbying, a specific engagement, a specific set of policy goals? What is the mechanism by which that happens? How is it made resonant with a larger and more diverse group of leaders? I want to see more work on that, again, like the mechanisms of that. I was also really interested, Shai, you were talking about the idea of some of this, like handing out a Bible as a kind of a salve for the soul, kind of appealing to some of that. I've been doing some work on the ways in which evangelical groups and other conservative groups have used disaster relief as a way to go and evangelize, and that's very much the language that they use, that they're caring for the kind of the whole spirit and body, which I think is very interesting. So I think, again, in the context of a world that is going to be increasingly beset by these disasters, really considering the way that religious organizations are operationalizing those threats to either pursue a particular policy agenda or a particular religious agenda. So I think those are potential directions.
I won't add too much to this because my comments were in some respects aimed at trying to get us to think about where we need to be looking in the future. But just first of all to say, Jeremy, so nice to see you, and thanks for the question. And yeah, I'm not sure how I feel about being described as an agenda setting scholar. That makes me feel a bit pressured and a bit anxious. But so thank you, and that not thank you. But anyway, short response is we need more safe legal pathways. Like that's abundantly clear. And so what are the obstacles to providing more safe legal pathways? And how do we overcome these obstacles? And that, I mean, if we're talking specifically about forced migration, that is where I think we need to be looking. And religion is just inextricably entangled with that, because now, as I briefly mentioned, the Islamic identity is inextricably entangled with the identity of refugee, and that is then also inextricably entangled with this idea of a security threat. So how do we overcome that? How do we address this entanglement of particular religious affiliations as part of national identities, and then that providing the criterion for who belongs and who doesn't? And that's become stronger, if anything, in the last 20 years or so, rather than less. So that, I think, and then also the ethical questions, like what do we owe to people whose countries are either going to disappear as a result of climate change or are going to be uninhabitable when they are relocated to another place? That's going to bring up all kinds of new conflicts. And how do we deal with that? How do we address the ethical and justice aspects of that? So, and religious actors, like a lot of people coming from like these small island nations, for example, Christianity is just, it permeates society in those contexts. So if we're going to just move these people to another country because they've lost their land, that's going to have to play a role in how they're resettled, how their community, how they integrate or connect with members in other country, in the host country. So that's my 2 cents on what we need to be researching into the future.
I don't want to preempt any of the comments or reflections from any of the panelists, but I have a question also that I'd like to ask, and I'll take my moderator's ability to do so and do so. So I thought it was quite interesting when a lot of the panelists were talking about bringing the religion back in and really evaluating and analyzing what role religion plays and doctrine and identity, not just thinking of these as non-state actors and organizations. And I appreciate that direction, but I wanted to also bring in the other direction and think about, so in my own work, I grapple, my current book project grapples with the outsourcing of security to private actors away from the state. I do a lot of very kind of abstract thinking around what is the boundary between public and private interest, and thinking about the public interest and parochial interests. writ large, and really grappling with this, and also challenging myself as to whether this idea of the public interest is even just kind of a 20th century phenomenon associated with peak state power, associated with the Cold War, or something like that. And so I guess without further babbling about this, I guess my question is, and I apologies to the historian in the group, but it is a little bit future focused about what the governance opportunities here are for governing and regulating private actors in this space. Because my observation is that the complexity of these challenges require private governance in some ways, private initiative require, and the biggest supplier are religious actors, historically and in a contemporary sense. And then the question becomes kind of the sticky governance aspect of regulating this space, from the point of view of the state and the public interest. And I just didn't know if anybody wanted to comment on that.
Just very quickly, I'll say, yes, this is a fascinating question. And I actually did a bit of work of looking at the sort of regulations that go along with funding from USAID to these transnational FBOs that are doing work all over the world. And one of the things that I find incredibly interesting and speaks to Katya, to your notion of this being kind of fuzzy, is the idea that they have this language, USAID does, of what kinds of religious acts are acceptable to be funded as part of your humanitarian work, your peace building work, or whatever it is that you're doing. And they'll have examples there of what is religious and what is not. But then, as Lauren alluded to earlier when she was speaking, on the ground, this looks very different from what's happening in this kind of abstract space when they're putting together a proposal and what they're going to include and that kind of thing. And so I think that your question of how do we regulate these kind of activities, especially when we're talking about faith-based organizations, is an excellent one. And I don't think that there are any easy answers.
So I wanted to circle back to David. And David, you don't have to feel any responsibility to respond like it's a conference and you have to respond to discussant or anything, but I wanted to turn it back to you.
Sure. My first words are just words of gratitude. I mean, this was just an incredible experience and humbling, and I just want to log off and just write my dissertation, hopefully one day. It's just based on all the excellent feedback, but it also points me in some very important directions to continue pushing forward in my project. And so thank you for that. All of the questions I think were very important and valid ones. Both in terms of like future research agendas, but also in like thinking about this specific example. And this topic of proselytization, and I know that's also often sort of a negative term, although there is a lot of research, I think many of you noted, about sort of this unique role of especially local faith communities, specifically in the global South context as well, the kind of sort of first responder role they play, and also sort of the positive contributions they can make in attending to the needs of people who've been displaced, people in crisis who both need material support, but also attentive to sort of recognizing how their social fabric has been completely disrupted and disorienting, and how they also need community. And I did some work for 2 years in Ecuador with Colombian refugees, and that was something that we grappled with in our work. But thinking about humanitarian corridors and thinking about how this is an example of faith, religious actors, and even recognizing that the three Christian groups that I cited are also quite different organizationally in their orientation and how they work. I mean, it's sometimes even hard to use faith-based organization or religious group as a general term, even for those three actors, because when you look at the way that they express who they are, and it's quite different. And San Egidio thinks of themselves as this, informal network of friendship. It's very, very decentralized in a lot of ways. And I think because the strength of those networks allow them to act and react, be able to respond differently than, say, I think the Waldensians, which are just historically a much smaller reality in Italy, but they were able to bring their strength to the table. Same with the Federation of Evangelical Churches, who kind of partnered with more professional NGOs in their reception, whereas San Egidio kind of relied on this diffuse network of communities and parishes and whatnot. So I think looking at that is important. But then in relation to the state, I wonder if what they're doing, that even though in their negotiation, they're kind of using this sort of a-religious approach in the sense of like, we can do this. And so that's really what matters to the state at the end of the day. There is some element of maybe proselytization. I mean, there is a lot of language coming from Pope Francis about how, Europe lacks a vision and trying to sort of get the European Union back to the roots of why they formed the Union. It's not just about trade or security. It's also this idea of forming a common identity and human rights. And I think that's why I tried to highlight those quotations from the religious actors to talk about how they're trying to fill a normative gap. And maybe in some ways are kind of proselytizing to the state, because they use this language of, this is a model and it can be replicated, and it shows that there are alternatives. And I think what's really interesting, the way the humanitarian corridors has developed, and I didn't touch on this right now, but even just in recent years, there's a certain political symbolism to what they do. I mean, if there is a discussion about the failure of the EU asylum system and the fact that you have to be physically on European soil to apply for asylum, then the communities say, well, here, we can creatively interpret this humanitarian visa and actually use it as a legal tool to allow people safe passage. So it kind of shows politicians, actually there is a solution, here it is, and then when it comes to sort of the failure around responsibility sharing between European nations and how they receive asylum seekers, they've created a humanitarian corridor, not from countries outside the EU, but from within. They've actually flown over refugees from Greece and to Italy and to other countries to say, hey, look, here's an example of how we can actually share in hospitality across Europe. So there's a certain evangelization, proselytization, maybe toward the state. I think speaks to Erin Wilson's point about, challenging the assumptions that states, are thinking purely in terms of national interest and exclusionary politics. They sort of try to appeal to their better angels and whatnot, not just to act better, but also partner with the strengths and unique values that the religious groups bring as well. But it does raise some important questions. I really did appreciate the questions around power. I mean, I think there's some really interesting work coming out around humanitarian governance that looks at how humanitarianism is a form of governance, that there is care, but there's also control. And it does raise some questions around the transparency. And in my work, I do, in addition to talking to some of the sort of high-level politicians and religious leaders at the negotiating table, I've been speaking with some of the religious actors who actually go to Lebanon and Ethiopia and engage in how do you operationalize, what does it mean to be vulnerable, and just kind of trying to unpack some of the issues around that as well. But something to continue working on. I'll stop there, but yeah, more that could be said, but yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you to David for providing the raw and polished material for all the panelists to reflect on, and finding a focal point and one that's exciting, reflecting a new generation of research and an important topic that the panelists wove in an interdisciplinary way through so much territory and space that it was a wonderful experience for me to learn and listen. Thank you also to Jeremy for asking that agenda setting question that really brought this interdisciplinary community together and talking about looking forward and focusing on that in such a short amount of time, having such a productive conversation. So thank you to everybody for participating.